Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture beyond the safety of city lights into the isolated heart of the countryside, where 10 people discovered that the most terrifying horrors are not the ones we imagine, but the ones that wait in silence just beyond the farmhouse door, in the shadows of forgotten barns, and along the roads where no one comes when you scream. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are documented accounts from people who walked into the countryside and barely walked back out. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the countryside, where civilization ends and terror begins. I'm writing this because the police told me documentation matters, and because I need someone else to know the signs in case he ever gets out. My name is McKenna. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, but my grandfather owned 87 acres of farmland outside Lawrence that had been in our family since 1894. When he passed in March of last year, the property came to me. The farmhouse had been empty for 3 years while he lived in assisted care, and the barn had not been used for actual farming since the 1980s. I am a freelance graphic designer, so location does not matter for my work. I thought restoring the property would give me purpose and a connection to family history. I thought wrong about what I would find there. The property sits 2 miles off County Road 29, down a gravel drive that cuts through overgrown soybean fields. The nearest neighbor is a cattle operation a mile and a half to the east. Cell service is inconsistent. The house is a 2-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding that had gone gray from neglect. The barn is a traditional gambrel structure, painted red decades ago, now faded to rust. There is a machine shed, a chicken coop, that has not held chickens since before I was born, and a storm cellar built into a hillside behind the house. When I arrived on April 3rd, the property looked exactly as it had during my childhood visits, just older and sadder. I spent the first week cleaning the house, room by room. The electricity and water still worked, though I had to replace fixtures and check every pipe. I set up my bedroom in what used to be my grandfather's room on the 2nd floor, facing east toward the sunrise. The window overlooked the barn and the machine shed. I could see the gravel drive and most of the front acreage from that vantage point. At night, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the sound of wind through the fields and sometimes coyotes in the distance. I found it peaceful at first. On April 11th, I decided to start clearing the barn. I had avoided it during the first week because it felt like a bigger project, and I wanted the house livable first. The barn had not been locked. The main doors faced south and opened with a rusted metal latch. Inside, the space smelled like old hay, motor oil, and wood rot. Sunlight came through gaps in the siding, illuminating dust that hung thick in the air. The ground floor held an ancient tractor, rusted implements, stacks of rotting lumber, and about 40 years of accumulated junk. A wooden ladder led up to the hayloft. I spent 3 hours sorting through debris, making piles of what could be salvaged, sold, or hauled to the dump. I felt good about the progress. That night, I woke at 2:47 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my phone immediately when I woke. I had heard something. Not a dream sound, but an actual noise that pulled me from sleep. I lay in bed, listening. The house settled and creaked in the way old houses do, but that was not what I heard. It came again, a metallic scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from outside. I got up and looked out my bedroom window. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see the outlines of the barn and shed. Nothing moved. The scraping stopped. I watched for 10 minutes, saw nothing, and went back to bed. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon dragging something. The next morning, I walked to the barn before breakfast. The main doors were open, not wide open, but parted by about 2 feet. I stood there staring at them, trying to remember if I had latched them properly the day before. I convinced myself I must have left them unsecured and the wind pushed them open. I went inside and immediately noticed something wrong. The piles I had organized were disturbed. Not destroyed, just rearranged slightly. A stack of lumber I had placed near the east wall was moved 3 feet toward the center. Tools I had hung on pegs were now on the workbench. I felt cold despite the morning sun. Someone had been in here. I walked through the barn slowly, looking for signs of entry or occupation. I found fresh boot prints in the dust near the ladder to the hayloft. They were not mine. My boots have a crosshatch tread. These had a diamond pattern, size 10 or 11, significantly larger than my women's size 8. The prints led to the ladder, then up into the loft. My heart started pounding. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. I climbed the ladder, moving slowly, listening for any sound above me. The loft was empty except for old hay bales and more junk. I checked every corner. No one was there. But near the loft window that faced the house, I found a hay bale positioned directly in front of the opening, flattened on top as if someone had sat there for an extended period. From that position, they would have a direct view into my bedroom window. I drove into Lawrence that afternoon and bought 2 motion sensor security cameras, heavy-duty padlocks, and a baseball bat. I installed one camera aimed at the barn entrance and another covering the gravel drive. I padlocked the barn doors from the outside and locked every door and window in the house. That night, I kept the baseball bat next to my bed and barely slept. At 3:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an alert from the barn camera. I opened the app with shaking hands. The camera showed a figure standing 15 feet from the barn doors, facing the camera directly. The infrared made their eyes reflect white. They wore dark clothing and a baseball cap. They stood completely still for 37 seconds, then walked calmly out of frame toward the north side of the barn, where the camera could not see. I called 911. The dispatcher said a deputy would be there within 20 minutes. I stayed on the line, watching the camera feed. The figure did not reappear. When Deputy Collins arrived 23 minutes later, I met him outside with a flashlight and showed him the footage on my phone. He walked the perimeter of the barn with his own flashlight and weapon drawn. He found the padlock on the barn doors intact, but discovered that the small side door on the north wall, which I had not thought to secure, was slightly ajar. He called for backup and entered the barn. I waited by his patrol car, shaking despite the warm night. He emerged 10 minutes later and said the barn was clear, but someone had definitely been inside. He found evidence of recent occupation in the loft. When Deputy Harris arrived as backup, they both went through the barn more thoroughly with high-powered flashlights. What they found made my skin crawl. In the hayloft, tucked behind a stack of bales in the far corner, someone had created a nest. There was a sleeping bag, military surplus style, olive green. Our backpack contained granola bars, beef jerky, bottles of water, and a flashlight. There was a notebook, the kind with a black and white marble cover. Most disturbing were the photographs. Printed on regular copy paper, dozens of photos of me taken through windows. Me working at my laptop in the kitchen. Me carrying trash to the burn pile. Me in the upstairs hallway in my pajamas. The photos were dated in pen on the back, starting on April 4th, the day after I arrived. The notebook contained logs, times I left the house, times I went to bed, times lights went on and off in various rooms, notes about my routine. Coffee at 7:15, works until noon, lunch in kitchen, afternoon outside, dinner at 6, upstairs by 10, dear. Written in careful print, organized by date. The logs went back 8 days. He had been watching me since the beginning. The deputies bagged everything as evidence and called for a forensics team. They searched the property for 2 more hours with additional officers who arrived. They found more boot prints circling the house, concentrated below my bedroom window. They found where he had defeated the lock on the chicken coop and sheltered there during rainstorms. They found snares, the kind used for trapping rabbits, positioned along paths I regularly walked. Deputy Collins told me I should not stay on the property alone. He said this was stalking behavior with clear escalation indicators. The snares particularly concerned him. They were not for animals. They were set at ankle height on paths through tall grass where someone walking at dusk might not see them. One was positioned between the house and my car. If I had stepped into it at speed, I would have fallen hard, possibly injured. The deliberate positioning suggested someone who wanted me incapacitated, not killed. Not yet. That word, yet, hung in the air between us. I packed a bag and drove to a hotel in Lawrence. I did not sleep that night either. Over the next 3 days, police worked the evidence. They identified the boot print as a common Red Wing work boot. The fingerprints from the water bottles came back with a match. His name was Leonard Pritchard, 42 years old, unemployed, with a history of trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault. He had served 18 months for attacking a woman in her home in Olathe in 2019. He was released in December. Police discovered he had a connection to the property. He had worked as a farmhand for my grandfather back in 2003, seasonal work during harvest. He knew the land. He knew which structures were abandoned. He had been squatting in various locations on the property for at least 3 weeks before I arrived, living in the barn, the machine shed, and the storm cellar at different times. They found the storm cellar was where he had stayed most recently. He had pried open the old wooden doors and made a more permanent camp underground where he could not be seen. He had a Coleman stove, more food, and more photographs. Some were of my grandfather from years ago. Some were recent, of me. He had written notes to himself about keeping the property safe and making sure she understands. The language was possessive and delusional. Police believed he saw the property as his in some distorted way, and my presence was an intrusion he was preparing to address violently. The snares were the beginning. On April 19th, police located Leonard Pritchard at a gas station in Eudora. He was arrested without incident. In his truck, they found my grandfather's toolbox stolen from the barn, along with rope, duct tape, zip ties, and a hunting knife. He had been planning to come back. In interviews, he refused to explain his actions, only saying he had rights to the property, and I was trespassing on his home. The psychological evaluation determined he was competent to stand trial. He was charged with stalking, burglary, criminal threat, and attempted kidnapping based on the evidence of planning. His bail was set at $500,000. He could not pay it. He remained in custody through the trial, which concluded in September. He was sentenced to 12 years in the Kansas Department of Corrections. I sold the property in August. I could not live there. I could not even visit without feeling his eyes on me. The new owners are a young family who plan to renovate everything and start a small organic farm. I hope they have better luck. I hope he never comes back when he is released. I documented everything for this reason. If someone else buys rural property that is sat empty, check every structure thoroughly before you move in. Check the barn lofts. Check the storm cellars. Check the crawl spaces. Look for signs of occupation, disturbed dust, boot prints that are not yours, food wrappers, bedding. Set up cameras before you settle in. Do not assume you are alone just because the property was empty. Sometimes empty places are only empty during the day. Sometimes someone else has already decided the property is theirs, and you are the one who does not belong. Sometimes the watcher in the barn is not a ghost. Sometimes he is real, and he is patient, and he is waiting for you to let your guard down. I learned that the hard way. I hope you do not have to. I am writing this because the official investigation report does not capture what actually happened on the trail that weekend, and because someone needs to understand that there are places in these mountains where time does not work the way it should. My name is Olivia. I have been hiking the Appalachian Trail system since I was 16 years old. I know these mountains, I know trail safety, and I know the difference between getting lost and something that should not be possible. What happened to Devian on October 12th was not something that follows any natural law I understand, and 4 years later, I still cannot explain it. The plan was straightforward. 4 of us were doing a weekend loop trail on the Tennessee and North Carolina border, starting at the Big Creek trailhead and covering approximately 23 miles over 3 days. The group was myself, my boyfriend Davian, and 2 friends we had hiked with before, Marcus and Janelle. We are all experienced hikers. Between the 4 of us, we had logged over 300 trail miles that year alone. We carried proper gear, GPS units, satellite communicators, first aid supplies, and enough food and water for 4 days, even though we only planned 3. We filed our itinerary with the ranger station. We did everything correctly. October 12th was a Friday. We started hiking at 9:20 in the morning under clear skies. The temperature was 58 degrees, perfect hiking weather. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked with white blazes every 100 feet or so. The terrain was moderate, nothing technical, mostly gradual elevation changes through mixed hardwood forest. We made good time and reached our first planned campsite at Walnut Bottom around 4:30 in the afternoon. We set up tents, filtered water from the creek, and cooked dinner as the sun set through the trees. That night, we sat around the fire talking about nothing important. Davian was in good spirits. He had just accepted a new job and was excited about the move to Asheville. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. We woke at 6:45 on Saturday morning. The weather was still clear, temperature in the low 40s. We broke camp, packed our gear, and started hiking by 8:00. The plan was to cover roughly 9 miles that day to our second campsite near Mount Sterling Ridge. The trail followed Gunter Fork Creek for the first 3 miles, staying relatively flat before beginning a steady climb. We hiked in a loose formation the way we always did. Janelle usually led because she set a good pace. I followed behind her. Marcus was third. Davian typically brought up the rear because he liked to take photos and did not mind falling back to get shots without holding up the group. We maintained visual or voice contact. That was our standard procedure. At approximately 10:15, we reached a section where the trail curved around a rocky outcrop and then straightened for about a quarter mile through a tunnel of rhododendron. Visibility was excellent. You could see 100 yards ahead easily. Janelle, Marcus, and I rounded the outcrop and continued on the straight section. Davian was maybe 30 seconds behind us, still in sight when we made the turn. Marcus looked back and confirmed he saw Davian following. We walked for perhaps 20 more seconds. I turned to say something to Davian about a bird I had heard, and he was not there. The trail behind us was empty. I stopped walking. I called his name. No response. Marcus and Janelle stopped and turned. We all called for him. Nothing. We waited, thinking he had stopped to adjust his pack or tie a boot. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Marcus walked back around the outcrop to where we had last seen him. He came back 15 seconds later, confused. Davian was not there. The trail was empty in both directions. We called his name louder. We used our whistles, 3 short blasts, the universal distress signal. We listened for a response. The forest was silent, except for wind in the leaves and the distant sound of the creek below us. We backtracked immediately. We walked a quarter mile back down the trail, calling his name continuously. We checked off trail in both directions, thinking maybe he had stepped aside for a bathroom break or twisted an ankle and fallen down the embankment. We found nothing. No response. No sign of disturbance in the underbrush. No broken branches. No boot prints leaving the trail. We returned to the spot where we had last confirmed visual contact and searched in a grid pattern, 20 feet on either side of the trail, for 100 yards in both directions. It had been less than 10 minutes since we had last seen him. He could not have gone far, but there was no trace of him. We tried his cell phone. No service, but we tried anyway. No connection. We activated our satellite communicator and sent an emergency message to search and rescue at 10:47. We continued searching and calling until a ranger arrived at 12:30 with 2 volunteers. They established a search perimeter and began a systematic sweep. By 3 p.m., there were 15 searchers, a dog team, and a helicopter. They searched until dark. They found nothing. No tracks. No dropped gear. No sign that anyone had left the trail. Davian had vanished in less than 30 seconds on a clear, straight trail with excellent visibility. The search continued for 3 days. They brought in thermal imaging, additional dog teams, and drone surveillance. They searched a 5-mile radius from the point of disappearance. They dragged the creek. They checked mine shafts and caves. They interviewed everyone on the trail that weekend. No one had seen him. No one had heard anything. On the 3rd day, October 15th, they found his backpack. It was placed on a flat rock 2 miles off trail to the northeast, in an area of dense forest that would have taken hours to reach on foot through extremely rough terrain. The backpack was sitting upright, clean, as if someone had carefully set it there. All his gear was inside, organized exactly as he had packed it. His water bottles were still full. His food was untouched. Nothing was missing except his phone. The discovery of the backpack changed the search parameters. They focused on the area surrounding the rock, thinking perhaps he was nearby, injured, or disoriented. They searched for 2 more days. They found nothing. On October 18th, the official search was suspended. The case was turned over to investigators as a missing person inquiry. They questioned us extensively. They checked Davian's background, his finances, his relationships. They looked for motive to disappear intentionally. There was none. He had no reason to run. He had no debts, no legal problems, no history of mental health issues. He was happy. He was planning a future. The investigators had no explanation. The case went cold. On October 21st, 9 days after he disappeared, Davian walked out of the forest. A ranger spotted him on a service road 12 miles south of where he vanished, walking calmly toward the ranger station. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn on the hike. He was not injured. He was not dehydrated or malnourished. He looked exactly as he had when he disappeared, except his boots were caked in red clay soil that does not exist anywhere in that area. When the ranger approached him and called his name, Davian seemed confused about why anyone was looking for him. He said he had only been gone for about 10 minutes. They took him to the hospital immediately. Physically, he was fine. Blood work was normal. No signs of drug use or head injury. Cognitively, he was lucid and coherent. But his memory of the 9 days was completely absent. He remembered hiking with us on October 12th. He remembered rounding the rocky outcrop. He remembered seeing us ahead on the trail. And then, from his perspective, he blinked and he was standing on a service road at dusk, alone, with no memory of anything in between. To him, no time had passed. It felt like 10 minutes. His watch had stopped at 10:16 a.m. on October 12th. It was a mechanical watch, not battery-powered. It had simply stopped working at the exact moment we lost sight of him. The medical examination revealed something else. On his back, between his shoulder blades, there were 3 marks. They were not cuts or bruises. They were more like burn scars, except they had not been there before. I knew his body. He had no scars on his back. These were new. They formed a perfect triangle, each mark about 2 inches long, raised and pale against his skin. The doctors could not explain them. The tissue showed characteristics of both old scar tissue and fresh burn simultaneously, which should not be possible. Davian had no memory of receiving them and felt no pain from them. He could not feel anything when they were touched. The skin was numb. The soil analysis from his boots came back with results that made no sense. The red clay contained mineral compositions consistent with soil found in the Smoky Mountains, but 50 miles south of where he reappeared. And the soil also contained pollen from plants that do not grow in October. The pollen was from spring-blooming species, trillium and bloodroot, that would not be present in mid-October. The lab assumed contamination, but they could not explain how his boots could be covered in soil from a location he could not have reached and pollen from the wrong season. Davian underwent extensive psychological evaluation. He was not lying. He genuinely had no memory of the missing time. Hypnosis was attempted to recover memories. Under hypnosis, he described walking on the trail, feeling suddenly disoriented, seeing us ahead but unable to call out, and then a sensation of falling even though he remained upright. He described light that was wrong, bright but not from the sun, and a sound like high-pitched ringing that made his teeth ache. Then nothing until he was on the service road. The hypnotist noted his physical distress during the session was genuine. His heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute when describing the light. He woke from hypnosis, disoriented and nauseated. The investigation officially concluded with no explanation. The report stated that Davian had become separated from the group due to unknown circumstances, experienced a dissociative episode possibly triggered by head injury despite no evidence of trauma, and wandered for 9 days with no memory of his actions. It was the only explanation they could offer that fit within acceptable parameters of reality, but it did not explain the backpack placement, the impossible soil, the scars, or the stopped watch. It did not explain how he survived 9 days without water or food and showed no physical effects. It did not explain how he vanished in 30 seconds on a straight trail. Davian and I did not stay together. He changed after that. Not in obvious ways, but in small things. He stopped sleeping well. He would wake at 3 a.m. and stare out windows. He developed a sensitivity to certain sounds, high-frequency noises that most people cannot hear. He said they made him feel sick. He stopped hiking entirely. He could not explain why, but being in the forest triggered panic attacks. He moved to Asheville as planned, but left after 6 months. Last I heard, he was living in Phoenix, as far from mountains and forests as he could get. I still hike these mountains. I returned to that exact trail section 2 years later, trying to understand. I walked the same path at the same time of day. Nothing happened. The trail was just a trail, but I carry a camera now that records continuously when I hike. I check it obsessively. I will not let 30 seconds pass without visual confirmation of everyone in my group. And I pay attention to my watch. If it ever stops for no reason, I will know something is wrong. I will know that whatever took Davian for 9 days is nearby, and time is about to break. I do not know what exists in these mountains that can make a person vanish and return with no memory and impossible evidence. I do not know if it was natural or something else, but I know it happened. I know Davian is still marked by it. And I know that some disappearances on these trails are not what the reports say they are. Sometimes people do not get lost, sometimes they are taken, and sometimes they come back. I am writing this because the police recommended I document everything I can remember, and because I want other people, especially women renting alone in rural areas, to know what signs to look for. My name is Kaylin. I am a software developer who works remotely, which means I can live anywhere with decent internet. In January of this year, I found a listing for a cottage rental in the Yorkshire countryside, about 40 minutes outside Leeds. The photos showed a charming stone cottage with exposed beams, a wood-burning stove, and windows overlooking rolling hills. The rent was reasonable, the owner seemed professional, and the isolation appealed to me after years of city noise. I signed a 1-year lease and moved in on January 15th. I thought I was living alone. I was wrong. The cottage was exactly as advertised: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined kitchen and living area, and a small garden surrounded by a low stone wall. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down a narrow country lane. The landlord, Mrs. Pemberton, lived in Leeds and managed several rural properties. She explained that the previous tenant had left abruptly in November, after only 4 months, breaking the lease. She said he had financial problems and disappeared without proper notice. She seemed frustrated about it, but assured me the cottage had been cleaned and inspected. She gave me 2 keys, one for the front door and one for the back. She mentioned that the attic access was locked and that she kept the only key because the space was used for storage of her personal items. I thought nothing of it. The first 2 weeks were perfect. I set up my workspace in the front bedroom with a view of the hills. I established a routine. I worked from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m., cooked simple meals, read in the evenings by the fire, and slept deeply in the quiet countryside nights. The cottage felt safe and comfortable. I had no concerns whatsoever. The only oddity was that the cottage smelled strange sometimes, a musty odor like unwashed clothes or damp earth. But I attributed it to the age of the building and the fact that it had sat empty for 2 months. Old cottages smell old. I did not think it was significant. On February 2nd, I noticed something small but strange. I had bought a box of tea biscuits and placed them in the cupboard above the sink. I am very particular about food inventory because I only grocery shop once a week. 3 days after buying the biscuits, the box was nearly empty. I had eaten perhaps 3. There should have been at least 10 remaining. I stared at the box, trying to remember if I had eaten more than I thought. I convinced myself I had been snacking mindlessly while working. I made a mental note to pay better attention. Over the next week, it happened again. Food disappeared, a block of cheese I had barely touched, half a loaf of bread, apples from the fruit bowl. I started to worry I was developing some kind of memory problem, eating without awareness. I began keeping a food journal, writing down everything I consumed. The discrepancies continued. Food was vanishing that I had not eaten. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. I thought perhaps I had mice or rats getting into the cupboards, even though I saw no droppings or gnaw marks. I bought airtight containers and transferred all my food into them. The disappearances stopped for 3 days. Then an entire container of crackers vanished, not eaten in the cottage. The container itself was gone. On February 14th, I came home from a rare trip into Leeds for a meeting. I had been gone for 6 hours. When I entered the cottage, I immediately felt something was wrong. Nothing obvious, just a sense that the space had been occupied while I was away. I walked through each room slowly. In the kitchen, a mug was in the sink that I had not used. It was still slightly warm. Someone had made tea in my cottage while I was gone. I felt my stomach drop. I checked the locks again. Front door locked, back door locked, all windows secure. No signs of forced entry, but someone had been inside. Someone had a key, or they were still inside. I called the landlord. She insisted no one else had keys except her, and she had not visited. She suggested perhaps I had used the mug that morning and forgotten. I had not. I knew I had not. She offered to come by the next day to check the property. I told her I would wait. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights on, listening to every creak and settling sound the old cottage made. At 2:30 in the morning, I heard something that was not the house settling. It was a footstep, a single, distinct footstep directly above me in the attic. I froze. I listened. It did not repeat. I sat there until dawn, too terrified to move. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at 10 a.m. I told her about the footstep. She looked at me with concern and said the attic was not accessible, that the door had been locked for years. I insisted we check. She reluctantly retrieved a key from her car, a large, old-fashioned key that looked like it belonged to a Victorian novel. We went upstairs to the landing between the 2 bedrooms. There was a narrow door I had assumed was a closet. She unlocked it. Behind the door was a steep staircase leading up into darkness. She found a light switch. The bulb was dim but functional. We climbed the stairs together. The attic was not storage. It was a living space. Someone had been living there. In the center of the attic, beneath the peaked roof, was a sleeping bag, unrolled and recently used. Beside it were supplies, bottled water, canned food, bread, my missing crackers, my missing cheese. There were empty food wrappers and bottles. There was a battery-powered lantern. There were clothes folded neatly in a corner, men's clothes, work trousers, and flannel shirts. And there were photographs. Dozens of photographs, pinned to the rafters with thumbtacks. Photographs of me sitting at my desk, me cooking in the kitchen, me reading by the fire, me sleeping in my bed. The photos were taken from above, through gaps in the floorboards. Mrs. Pemberton made a sound like a strangled gasp. We both stood there, staring. I felt nausea rise in my throat. Someone had been living above me for weeks, watching me through the floor. I looked up at the beams and saw it clearly now. Small holes drilled through the wood at intervals, positioned directly above the rooms below. Spy holes. Someone had modified the attic to observe the entire cottage. Mrs. Pemberton pulled out her phone and called the police. We backed down the stairs and went outside to wait. I felt like my skin was crawling. Every moment I had spent in that cottage, every private moment, someone had been watching from above. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers searched the attic thoroughly and confirmed what we had found. They also found something else. A hidden access point at the back of the attic behind a stack of old boxes, leading to a removable panel in the exterior wall. The panel opened to the roof of a small shed that adjoined the back of the cottage. Someone could climb onto the shed roof, access the panel, and enter the attic without ever using the locked door from inside. The attic had its own secret entrance. The lock on the interior door was irrelevant. Whoever was living there could come and go freely from outside. The police took the photographs, the food, and the clothing as evidence. They fingerprinted the attic. The prints came back with a match within hours. His name was Daniel Forster, 36 years old. He was the previous tenant, the one who had supposedly left in November due to financial problems. He had not left. He had moved into the attic. When his lease ended and Mrs. Pemberton reclaimed the keys, he simply stayed, hidden above, waiting for the next tenant, waiting for me. Police located Daniel Forster at a pub in the nearby village that same evening. He was arrested without resistance. In his possession was a key to the cottage, a copy he had made before returning the original to Mrs. Pemberton. He had been entering through the front door when I was out, and through the attic panel at night. In his wallet, he had a piece of paper with my work schedule written on it, times I typically left the cottage and returned. He had been studying me, learning my patterns. During the interrogation, he showed no remorse. He stated that he had rights to the property because he had lived there first. He said I was temporary and he was permanent. He said he had been planning to wait until I left, but was running out of patience. Further investigation revealed that Daniel Forster had a history. He had been evicted from 2 previous rentals for refusing to leave and had been arrested for trespassing at one of them. He had convictions for harassment and stalking from 2018 involving a former girlfriend. The psychological evaluation performed after his arrest indicated he had delusional beliefs about ownership and territorial obsession. He genuinely believed that once he occupied a space, it belonged to him permanently. He saw my presence as theft of his home. The evidence in the attic combined with his statements led to charges of burglary, stalking, harassment, and violation of privacy. He was denied bail. His trial concluded in July. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I moved out of the cottage the day after his arrest. I did not spend another night there. I could not. Knowing he had been above me while I slept, while I showered, while I lived my life thinking I was alone, it was unbearable. I have nightmares about it still. I dream that I hear footsteps above me and wake up terrified, even though I now live in a ground floor flat with neighbors on all sides. Mrs. Pemberton refunded my rent and security deposit. She had the attic entrance sealed permanently and installed security systems in all her properties. She felt terrible, but the truth is no one knew. Daniel Forster had been clever and patient. He had created a hidden life in the walls and waited. I am writing this because I want people to understand that rural isolation has risks that urban living does not. When you rent alone in the countryside, check everything. Check the attic, even if the landlord says it is locked. Check for access points from the outside. Install your own cameras. Pay attention to food disappearing, to smells, to sounds that do not make sense. Do not dismiss your instincts. I dismissed mine for too long because I did not want to seem paranoid. I told myself I was imagining things. I was not. He was there the entire time, watching, waiting, living in the walls like a parasite. If I had ignored the footstep, if I had not insisted Mrs. Pemberton open that door, I do not know what would have happened. I do not know how long he would have waited or what he planned to do when his patience ran out. I'm lucky I found out when I did. Not everyone is that lucky. Sometimes the tenant who moved out never actually left. Sometimes they are still there, hidden, watching, and waiting for their moment. I am writing this because what I experienced on Route 9 cannot be explained by any rational means, and because I need to document it before I start questioning my own sanity. My name is Janessa. I am a registered nurse, which means I am trained to observe details, trust evidence, and remain calm in situations that would panic most people. I am not superstitious. I do not believe in ghosts or the supernatural. At least, I did not until the night of March 23rd when I picked up a hitchhiker on a freezing Montana highway and watched her vanish from my locked car while it was moving at 60 miles per hour. I have spent the last 6 months trying to find a logical explanation. I cannot. What happened was impossible, but it happened. I live in Billings, Montana. My parents live in a small town called Roundup, about 50 miles north. I visit them twice a month, usually on weekends when my hospital shifts allow. On March 23rd, I worked a double shift that ended at 11 p.m. I was exhausted but wanted to see my parents before my mother's surgery the following week. I decided to make the drive that night rather than wait until morning. It was a decision I have questioned every day since. Route 9 is a state highway that cuts through open farmland and ranch land. During the day, it is peaceful. At night, it is desolate. There are no towns between Billings and Roundup, just occasional ranch houses set far back from the road, their lights barely visible across the dark fields. I left Billings at 11:30 p.m. The temperature was 19 degrees. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the moon was bright enough to see the landscape in shades of gray. My car, a 2019 Honda Accord, was running perfectly. I had a full tank of gas, my phone was charged, and I was alert despite the long shift. I am an experienced night driver. I felt no concern about the trip. For the first 20 minutes, I saw no other vehicles. Route 9 at midnight is empty. The road stretched ahead in a straight line, flanked by barbed wire fences and dormant fields covered in frost. I had my music playing softly, something familiar and calming. Everything was routine. At approximately 11:52 p.m., my headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder of the road ahead. As I got closer, I saw it was a young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing a dress that looked completely inappropriate for the weather. It was a light-colored dress, pale blue or gray, knee-length, with short sleeves. She wore no coat, no hat, no gloves. She was hitchhiking, her arm extended with her thumb out in the universal gesture. My first thought was that she must be freezing to death. My second thought was that something was very wrong. No one hitchhikes on Route 9 at midnight in March wearing a summer dress. I slowed down. My instinct as a nurse overrode my caution about picking up strangers. If she stayed out in that cold much longer, she would develop hypothermia. I pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of her and stopped. I turned on my interior light and watched her in my rearview mirror as she walked toward my car. She moved slowly, not hurrying despite the cold. Her movements seemed odd, almost mechanical. When she reached the passenger door, she stood there waiting. I unlocked the door. She opened it and slid into the passenger seat without a word. The cold air that came in with her was intense, colder than it should have been, and it carried a smell like wet earth and old rain. I looked at her directly for the first time. She was young, pale, with dark hair that hung straight and damp as if she had been caught in rain, even though the night was dry. Her dress was definitely vintage, something from the 1980s, with a pattern of small flowers. Her skin was colorless, almost gray in the dim light. Her eyes were dark and unfocused. She did not look at me. She stared straight ahead through the windshield. I asked her if she was okay. She did not respond. I asked where she was going. After a long pause, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. She gave me an address, 42722 Route 9. She said it twice, the same way both times, like she was reciting something memorized. I knew roughly where that was, about 15 miles ahead. I told her I would take her there and asked if she needed me to call anyone. She did not answer. I turned the heat up to maximum, thinking she must be in shock from the cold. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway. She sat completely still, hands folded in her lap, staring forward. I kept glancing at her, concerned. She was not shivering. That worried me. When people stop shivering in the cold, it means their body temperature has dropped dangerously low. I asked her name. No response. I asked how long she had been outside. Nothing. It was like talking to a statue. The drive toward the address felt longer than it should have. The road seemed darker despite the moonlight. I kept checking my speedometer to make sure I was maintaining speed because it felt like I was barely moving. The woman beside me did not move at all. She did not blink. I watched for it specifically. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on the road ahead, unblinking. That is not normal. People blink reflexively every few seconds. She did not. I felt a creeping unease starting in my chest. Something was profoundly wrong. I thought maybe she was catatonic, experiencing some kind of psychological break. I decided I would take her to the address she gave, and if no one was there, I would bring her to the hospital and round up. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, I saw a mailbox ahead, on the right side of the road with numbers on it. 42722. I slowed down and turned into the driveway. My headlights swept across an old farmhouse set back about 100 feet from the road. The house was dark, not just lights off, but abandoned dark. The windows were broken. The porch was collapsed on one side. No one had lived there in years. I stopped the car and turned to tell the woman that the house was abandoned, that we needed to find somewhere else. The passenger seat was empty. She was gone. I stared at the empty seat. The seatbelt was still buckled, the way she had fastened it when she got in. The door had not opened. I would have heard it. I would have felt the cold air. The door locks were still engaged. I looked in the back seat. Empty. I looked out all the windows. No one was outside. She had vanished from a locked car without opening the door while I was driving. That is not possible. People cannot disappear from moving vehicles. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding. I checked the seat for evidence she had been there. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, even with the heat running. I got out of the car with my phone flashlight and walked toward the farmhouse, calling out, asking if anyone was there. The house was clearly abandoned, the door hanging open on broken hinges. I did not go inside. I stood in the driveway, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I got back in the car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking. I sat there for several minutes, trying to calm down. Finally, I drove the remaining distance to my parents' house. I arrived at 12:40 a.m. I did not tell them what happened. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I drove back to the farmhouse in daylight. In the clear light of day, it looked even more derelict. The roof was partially caved in. The yard was overgrown. There was a real estate sign, half fallen in the weeds, so faded I could barely read it. I took photos of the house and the address. I drove back to Billings that afternoon and spent hours researching. I searched for the address, 4772 Route 9. I found property records. The house had been abandoned since 1995. Before that, it belonged to a family named Whitmore. I searched for news articles related to the address and found something that made my blood run cold. On March 23, 1987, exactly 38 years before the night I picked her up, a 22-year-old woman named Rebecca Whitmore died in a car accident on Route 9. She had been at a party in Billings and was hitchhiking home. A drunk driver struck her around midnight approximately 2 miles south of her family's farmhouse. She died at the scene. The article included a photo. I recognized her immediately. Same face, same dark hair, same pale blue dress with small flowers. It was her. The woman in my car was Rebecca Whitmore, or something that looked like her. I contacted the Montana Highway Patrol and asked if there were records of other reports involving hitchhikers on Route 9. The dispatcher was hesitant but eventually transferred me to a sergeant who had been with the patrol for 20 years. I explained what happened. There was a long silence. Then he told me I was not the first. He said they receive reports every few years, always around the same date, late March. Always the same description, a young woman in a blue dress hitchhiking at night. Always gives the same address. Always vanishes from the vehicle. He said the reports go back to the early 1990s. He said officially they classify them as hoaxes or mistaken identity. Unofficially, he said every officer who has worked Route 9 long enough knows about the girl in the blue dress. He said she appears on the anniversary of her death. He said I should feel lucky she did not cause an accident. Some drivers panic and crash. I obtained a copy of the accident report from 1987 through a public records request. Rebecca Whitmore was struck at 11:57 p.m. on March 23, 1987, at mile marker 34 on Route 9. She was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m. The location where I picked up the hitchhiker was approximately mile marker 33. The timing matched. I picked her up at 11:52 p.m. on March 23rd. I dropped her at her family home, the place she was trying to reach when she died. She never made it home that night in 1987. Somehow, she is still trying. I spoke with a woman in Roundup who has lived there her entire life. She remembered the Whitmore family. She said Rebecca was a sweet girl, always helping others. She said the family moved away after her death, unable to live in the house where they waited for a daughter who never came home. She said locals avoid Route 9 late at night in March. She said the story is well known, but not talked about openly because people do not want to sound crazy. She said I was not crazy. She said I had given Rebecca a ride home, the ride she has been trying to complete for 38 years. I've driven Route 9 several times since then, but never at night, and never in late March. I do not know if I will see her again. I do not know if what I experienced was a ghost, a residual haunting, or something else beyond human understanding. What I know is this. I picked up a woman who died in 1987. She sat in my car. She smelled like rain and earth. She gave me an address. And when I reached that address, she vanished without opening the door. I have her photograph from the newspaper. I have the accident report. I have the testimony of others who have seen her. The evidence is undeniable. Rebecca Whitmore died on Route 9 trying to get home. And every year, on the anniversary of her death, she tries again. If you drive Route 9 late at night in March and you see a young woman in a blue dress, you can stop or you can keep driving. But if you stop, understand that you are not picking up a living person. You are giving a ride to someone who has been trying to get home for nearly 4 decades. I do not regret stopping. I hope she made it inside this time. I hope she found whatever she was looking for. But I will never forget the feeling of turning to speak to her and finding an empty seat where a person had been seconds before. Some things cannot be explained. Some people never stop trying to go home, even after death. I am writing this because I need to document what I heard in that farmhouse before I convince myself it was just exhaustion or stress playing tricks on my mind. My name is Kiana. I work as a data analyst for a tech company in Dublin, and my job is entirely remote. In February of this year, family friends of my parents asked if I would house sit their property in rural County Clare while they traveled to Australia for 6 weeks to visit their daughter. The property is a renovated farmhouse on 12 acres. Isolated but beautiful, with views of rolling hills and stone walls that have stood for centuries. I agreed because I wanted quiet, and because they offered to cover my expenses in exchange for maintaining the property and feeding their 2 cats. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought I would get a lot of work done. I did not expect to encounter something that has no rational explanation. The farmhouse is located outside the village of Crusheen, down a narrow road that turns to gravel after the first mile. The nearest neighbor is over half a mile away. The house itself is over 200 years old, renovated extensively in the 2010s with modern plumbing, heating, and electricity, but retaining the original stone walls and beam ceilings. It has 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room with a fireplace, and a small study where I set up my workspace. The cell phone signal is weak but functional. There is no Wi-Fi because the previous internet installation failed, and the landline phone works only intermittently. The family had warned me about the isolation and the unreliable communication, but I assured them I would be fine. I am comfortable alone. I arrived on February 10th. The family gave me a thorough tour, showed me where everything was kept, introduced me to the cats Finn and Maeve, and left detailed instructions for their care. They mentioned casually that the house has a few quirks. The heating system makes clanking noises. The wind can sound loud through the chimney. The old transistor radio in the sitting room sometimes picks up strange signals because of the terrain and atmospheric conditions. They said if I wanted music or news, I should use my phone instead. They left on February 11th, and I settled into a routine. I worked during the day, cooked simple meals, read in the evenings, and went to bed early. The cats were good company. The house felt comfortable. For the first week, everything was completely normal. On the night of February 17th, I woke at 3:15 in the morning. I know the exact time because I checked my phone immediately. I had been woken by a sound, not a loud sound, but distinct enough to pull me from sleep. It was coming from downstairs. I lay in bed listening. It was the radio. Someone had turned on the radio in the sitting room. I could hear it faintly through the floor, static and voices. I assumed I had left it on accidentally, even though I had not touched it. I got up, pulled on a robe, and went downstairs. The sitting room was dark except for the faint glow of the radio dial. The radio was on. I walked over to turn it off and stopped. The sound coming from the speakers was not a normal broadcast. It was children singing. The song was a nursery rhyme, something old and familiar, but I could not place it immediately. The children's voices were high and thin, singing in unison without accompaniment. The sound quality was strange, scratchy and distant, like a very old recording. I stood there, listening. The song ended, and there was a pause filled with static. Then a man's voice spoke. The voice was calm, measured, and clear despite the static. He said a series of numbers, coordinates. I recognized the format immediately. Latitude and longitude. He repeated them twice, exactly the same way both times. Then he gave instructions. Bring flowers, bring stones, remember the names. The broadcast ended abruptly, cutting to silence. I stood there, staring at the radio, my heart pounding. I turned it off and unplugged it. I went back to bed but did not sleep. I told myself it was some kind of pirate radio station, or an old recording being rebroadcast as a prank or art project. Rural areas sometimes pick up strange signals. It meant nothing, but I could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, I searched online for the coordinates the voice had given. I wrote them down from memory as accurately as I could. The coordinates pointed to a location approximately 3 miles from the farmhouse, in an area of open fields near a small forest. I checked maps and satellite images. There was nothing obviously notable about the location, just fields. I told myself to forget about it. That night at 3:17 a.m., it happened again. I woke to the sound of the radio. I'd left it unplugged. I went downstairs. The radio was on, glowing softly in the darkness. The same broadcast. Children singing the same nursery rhyme. The same man's voice giving the same coordinates and instructions. Bring flowers. Bring stones. Remember the names. I unplugged the radio again and checked the plug. It had not been connected to the wall. The radio had turned on without power. That is not possible. Transistor radios require batteries or electrical power. This radio had neither. It should not have worked. I took the batteries out and left the radio in a cupboard. I did not sleep the rest of the night. On February 19th, I called my parents and told them what was happening. They suggested I was overtired or stressed. I called the family I was house-sitting for. They were sympathetic, but said they had never experienced anything like that. They suggested the radio might be malfunctioning and told me to just leave it unplugged and ignore it. I tried. That night, at 3:17 a.m., I heard the broadcast again. Not from the radio, from outside. I heard the children singing, faint but unmistakable, coming through the bedroom window. I got up and looked outside. There was nothing, just darkness and fields. The singing continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped. The man's voice followed, giving the coordinates again. I could hear it clearly, as if it were being broadcast from somewhere nearby. But there was no source, no lights, no vehicles, nothing. I decided I needed to know what was at those coordinates. On February 20th, in full daylight, I drove to the location. It took me 20 minutes to reach the area, following narrow roads and then walking across a field. The coordinates led me to a spot near the edge of a small wooded area. There was nothing there initially, just grass and stones. Then I noticed the stones were arranged in a pattern. They formed a rough circle, partially overgrown with moss and weeds. In the center of the circle, someone had placed flowers recently. They were fresh, not more than a few days old. Beside the flowers was a small handwritten note, laminated to protect it from weather. The note listed 7 names, all children's names. At the bottom, it gave a date, November 3rd, 1952. I took photos of everything and returned to the farmhouse. I spent hours researching online. I searched for the date and the location. I found an archived newspaper article from the Irish Times, November 1952. A school near Crusheen had burned down on November 3rd, 1952. 7 children died in the fire. They were trapped in a classroom when the roof collapsed. The article listed their names. They matched the names on the note exactly. The school had been located on the site I had visited. It had been demolished after the fire, and the land returned to agricultural use. There was no memorial, no marker, just the circle of stones that someone or multiple people over the years had maintained. I spoke to a woman in Crusheen who worked at the local heritage center. I asked her about the school fire. She knew the story. She said it was a tragedy that the community never fully recovered from. She said the families of the children had wanted a memorial, but there was no money and no land available. She said over the years, people have left flowers at the site on the anniversary of the fire. She said there are stories about the broadcast. She hesitated before telling me, clearly uncomfortable. She said since the early 1960s, people living in the area have reported hearing a radio broadcast late at night. Always around 3 a.m., always children singing, followed by coordinates and a request to bring flowers and remember the names. She said the broadcast happens sporadically, not every night, but regularly enough that it is known. She said no one has ever found a source. She said it is considered a local ghost story. I asked if anyone had investigated scientifically. She said yes, several times. In the 1980s, a group of university students spent a week in the area with recording equipment. They captured the broadcast on tape. Audio analysis confirmed it was children's voices and an adult male voice, but the recording quality suggested it was from the 1950s based on the technology and sound characteristics. The broadcast could not be traced to any active radio station or frequency. It simply appeared on multiple receivers simultaneously and then stopped. The coordinates given in the broadcast have always pointed to the location of the old school. The instructions have never changed. Bring flowers. Bring stones. Remember the names. I continued to hear the broadcast every few nights for the rest of my stay at the farmhouse. Always at 3:17 a.m., sometimes from the radio, even when it had no power, sometimes from outside, as if carried on the wind. I stopped trying to rationalize it. I brought flowers to the site twice more during my 6 weeks there. I do not know why. It felt like the right thing to do. On my final visit, March 20th, I found fresh flowers already there, and a new note with the same 7 names. Someone else was listening. Someone else was remembering. I left the farmhouse on March 24th when the family returned. I did not tell them the full extent of what I experienced. I told them the radio was faulty and I had stored it away. They thanked me for taking care of the property. I have not been back. I do not plan to return. But I still think about those children, trapped in a burning school 73 years ago. I think about the broadcast, repeating year after year, asking people to remember. I do not know if it is a residual haunting, some kind of psychic imprint of trauma, or something else entirely. What I know is that 7 children died, and something or someone wants their deaths acknowledged. The broadcast is not malicious. It is a request, a plea. Remember the names. Bring flowers. Do not let them be forgotten. I documented the names here for that reason. They were real children. They died in a fire that no one talks about anymore. Their names were Siobhan, Liam, Aoef, Cillian, Niamh, Padraig, and Roisin. I am writing them down so they are remembered. Maybe that is what the broadcast wants. Maybe if enough people remember, it will stop. Or maybe it will continue forever. A voice from 1952 reaching through time, refusing to let tragedy be erased by silence. I am writing this as a warning to anyone who hunts on private or public land, especially those who return to the same locations year after year. What my brother and I experienced during the 2024 deer season in Michigan has made me question whether I will ever hunt again. My name is Kaladin. I have been hunting since I was 12 years old. My younger brother and I have used the same 40 acres of family land in the Upper Peninsula for nearly 15 years. We know every trail, every clearing, every likely spot for game. We thought we knew every structure on the property. We were wrong. What we found during opening weekend revealed that someone had been watching hunters on our land for years, and that we were not the first people he had targeted. We were just the first ones who made it out. Our family land is located in Marquette County, roughly 8 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a 2-track logging road that becomes impassable in winter. The property borders state forest land on 2 sides, which means during hunting season there can be occasional traffic from other hunters, but our section is clearly marked with posted signs. We have a semi-permanent camp consisting of a canvas wall tent, a fire ring, a bear-proof food locker, and a basic latrine. We typically arrive the Thursday before opening day, set up camp, scout the area, and hunt Saturday through Tuesday before packing out. It is a tradition that has remained unchanged for over a decade. This year, we arrived on November 14th at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The weather was cold, temperature in the low 20s, with snow cover from an early storm the previous week. We unloaded our gear from the truck and began setting up camp in our usual spot near a small creek. My brother, whose name I will not use here at his request, noticed something immediately. There was a hunting blind approximately 60 yards from our camp that had not been there during turkey season in May. It was a simple structure, plywood walls painted in camouflage pattern with narrow horizontal slits for observation. It faced directly toward our camp, not toward game trails, not toward natural funnels where deer would travel. It was positioned to observe our campsite. We walked over to examine it. The The blind was well constructed, weathered enough to have been there for at least several months. Inside, we found cigarette butts, at least 20 of them, all the same brand, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and photographs. They were printed on standard copy paper, tucked into a plastic bag to protect them from moisture. The photographs showed hunters at our campsite. Not us, but other people we did not recognize. Photos of men sitting by the fire, hanging game, sleeping in tents. The photos were taken from the exact position of the blind, through the observation slit. Some were dated on the back in pen. The dates went back 3 years. Someone had been watching hunters on our property for at least 3 seasons. We immediately checked the property boundaries. All our posted signs were intact. This blind was definitely on our land, not on the adjacent state forest. Someone had trespassed and built a surveillance position. We searched the area around the blind and found a trail leading deeper into the woods, away from our camp. We followed it. Approximately a quarter mile in, we found a second blind. This one was positioned to observe a different clearing, a spot we sometimes used for field dressing game. It contained the same evidence, cigarette butts, food waste, and more photographs. These photos showed hunters processing deer, their backs turned to the camera, vulnerable and focused on their work. My brother wanted to leave immediately and call the county sheriff. I convinced him we should search the rest of the property first to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. We spent the next 2 hours walking systematic grid patterns. We found 5 blinds total, 5 surveillance positions arranged in a rough perimeter around the areas we typically used for camping and hunting. All faced inward. All were positioned to observe human activity, not wildlife. The final blind we discovered was the most disturbing. It was positioned on a small rise overlooking the 2-track road leading into our property. It gave a clear view of anyone arriving or leaving. Inside this blind, in addition to the usual trash and photographs, we found a notebook. The notebook was a composition book, the kind used in schools. It contained logs, dates, times, vehicle descriptions, and license plate numbers. Our truck was listed, along with descriptions of us. The entries went back to 2021. The handwriting was neat and methodical. Each entry followed the same format: date, arrival time, vehicle type and color, number of occupants, departure time. There were entries for dozens of different vehicles. At the bottom of several pages there were notes. 2 men, mid-30s, rifles visible, stayed 3 days, vulnerable at night. Solo hunter, elderly, slow-moving, easy target. The word target appeared multiple times. This was not casual observation, this was predatory surveillance. We returned to our camp and called 911 on our satellite phone. Cell service is non-existent on the property, but we carry a satellite communicator for emergencies. The dispatcher told us a deputy would respond, but it would take at least 90 minutes due to our remote location. She advised us to stay together, stay armed, and avoid disturbing the blinds further. We packed our rifles, loaded them, and waited by the fire. The sun was setting. The temperature was dropping. The woods around us, which had always felt like home, suddenly felt hostile. Every sound made us turn. Every shadow looked like a person. We kept the fire high and the lights on. At approximately 6:45 p.m., we heard whistling. It came from the woods to the north, a single sharp whistle like someone signaling. We stood and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. 10 seconds later, another whistle answered from the south. Then a third from the east. Someone, or multiple people, were surrounding our camp. We shouted that we were armed and that police were on the way. The whistling stopped. We heard movement in the brush, not running, just steady movement through the underbrush, circling our position. My brother fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest. The movement stopped. We waited, rifles ready, for what felt like an eternity. At 8:15 p.m., we saw headlights coming up the 2-track road. We assumed it was the sheriff. It was not. A pickup truck, older model, dark-colored, approached slowly with only parking lights on, not full headlights. It stopped approximately 50 yards from our camp and idled. No one got out. We could not see through the windshield in the darkness. We shouted, identifying ourselves and asking who was there. No response. The truck sat there, engine running for nearly 5 minutes. Then it reversed slowly back down the 2-track and disappeared. My brother got the license plate with his phone camera using maximum zoom. The truck was registered to a local address, we learned later. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 8:50 p.m., accompanied by a state conservation officer. We showed them the blinds, the photographs, and the notebook. They took everything as evidence and called for additional units. By 10 p.m., there were 6 law enforcement officers on our property, conducting a full search with high-powered lights and thermal imaging. They found more than we had. Hidden in a natural depression approximately 300 yards from our camp, they found a dugout shelter covered with branches and tarps. Inside were supplies, food, water, ammunition, a sleeping bag, and weapons, a compound bow, a crossbow, and a large hunting knife. There were also trophies, personal items that did not belong to us, watches, wallets, knives, and identification cards. The IEDs belonged to 5 different men. The officers recognized 2 of the names immediately. 2 hunters had been reported missing in Marquette County over the past 4 years. Both had been hunting alone on state forest land adjacent to private parcels. One disappeared in 2021, the other in 2023. Their vehicles were found at trailheads, but no trace of the men was ever located. The searches had been extensive, but ultimately unsuccessful. The assumption had been that they became disoriented, succumbed to exposure, or suffered medical emergencies in remote areas where their bodies would not easily be found. The discovery of their identification in the dugout changed everything. These were not disappearances. These were homicides. The investigation moved quickly. The fingerprints from the cigarette butts and water bottles came back within 24 hours. His name was Michael Kearns, 47 years old, a local resident with a history of poaching, trespassing, and assault. He had served time for felony assault in 2015 after beating a man nearly to death in a bar fight. He lived alone in a cabin approximately 12 miles from our property. The pickup truck that had approached our camp was registered to him. On November 16th, law enforcement executed a search warrant on his property. What they found confirmed the worst. In his cabin, they discovered detailed maps of multiple hunting properties in the county, both private and public land. Each map had surveillance positions marked. They found more photographs, hundreds of them, showing hunters across different locations and years. They found a journal where he had documented his activities. He referred to it as hunting the hunters. He wrote about watching people, learning their patterns, waiting for opportunities when they were alone or vulnerable. He described 3 killings in detail, the 2 missing hunters whose IDs were found, and a third man whose disappearance had been attributed to a hiking accident in 2019. He described how he had used snares and tripwires to incapacitate his victims, then killed them with arrows to avoid the sound of gunfire. He described disposing of the bodies in remote areas, weighted and submerged in deep water, or buried in locations he had prepared in advance. Michael Kearns was arrested at his workplace on November 17th. He worked at a hardware store, a regular job, normal interactions with the community. No one suspected what he did during hunting season. During interrogation, he showed no remorse. He said hunters were trespassers on his land, even though he owned no land. He said the state forest belonged to him and others were poaching his territory. He was delusional, possessive, and violent. The psychological evaluation determined he had antisocial personality disorder and paranoid delusions about ownership of public land. He genuinely believed he had the right to kill anyone he perceived as encroaching on his hunting areas. Search teams spent weeks looking for the bodies of his victims based on locations described in his journal. They recovered 2 of the 3 confirmed victims. The third remains missing. The investigation is ongoing. Kearns has been charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of stalking, and various other felonies. He is being held without bail. His trial is scheduled for next year. Prosecutors are seeking life without parole. My brother and I have not returned to our family land. We cannot. Knowing that he was there, watching us year after year, waiting for the right moment, is unbearable. We were lucky. If we had not found those blinds, if we had not searched the property, if we had stayed another night alone, we might have become his next victims. The sheriff told us we did everything right. We stayed together. We stayed armed, we called for help, and we did not let him isolate us. Those were the things that saved our lives. Solo hunters were his preferred targets. People alone, focused on the hunt, unaware they were being hunted themselves. I am writing this because I want other hunters to understand that remote areas attract more than just people who love the outdoors. They attract predators, human predators who use the isolation to their advantage. If you hunt on the same land every year, check for structures that should not be there. Check for surveillance positions. Look for signs of human activity in places where there should be none. If you find evidence that someone has been watching your camp or your hunting areas, leave immediately and report it. Do not confront them alone. Do not assume it is harmless. Michael Kearns watched hunters for years before he started killing them. He studied patterns. He waited for vulnerability. He was patient. If you hunt alone, reconsider. If you camp in remote areas, stay alert. The woods are not always empty. Sometimes someone is watching. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. We survived because we found the blinds before he decided we were his next targets. Not everyone has been that lucky. I am writing this because what happened on our family farm in Wisconsin defies every rational explanation I have tried to construct, and because I need someone else to know that there are things that can mimic human voices with perfect accuracy for reasons we do not understand. My name is Jackson. I grew up on a dairy farm outside Marathon, Wisconsin, and I have spent most of my life around animals and in rural environments. I do not believe in superstitions. I trust what I can observe and measure. But what my family experienced over a 3-week period in September of this year cannot be measured or explained by any framework I understand. Something in our barn learned our voices and used them against us. Something tried to lure us out into the dark by speaking with our own mouths. I do not know what it was. I only know it was not human, and it had no good intentions. The farm has been in our family since 1947. My parents, both in their late 60s, still operate it with my help. We have 40 dairy cows, a small beef cattle operation, chickens, and 2 barn cats. The property is 120 acres, mostly pasture and hayfields, with the main farmhouse, a large red barn built in 1952, a machine shed, and a few outbuildings. I moved back home 2 years ago after my father had a minor stroke to help with the heavy labor. We have a routine that has not changed much in decades. Morning milking at 5 a.m., evening milking at 5 p.m., daily maintenance in between. The work is hard but predictable. Our lives are governed by the needs of the herd. There is no room for disruption. What happened in September disrupted everything. It started on September 8th. I had finished evening milking and was walking back to the house around 6:30 p.m. The sun was setting, the sky still light but the shadows lengthening across the yard. I was halfway between the barn and the house when I heard my mother calling my name from the barn. Her voice was clear and unmistakable. She called my name the way she always does when she needs help with something, slightly drawn out, with a rising inflection at the end. I stopped and turned back toward the barn. I called out, asking what she needed. There was no response. I walked back to the barn and looked inside. The barn was empty except for the cows in their stanchions calmly chewing cud. No one was there. I walked through the entire structure, checking the feed room, the milk house, the hayloft, Nothing. I walked back to the house, confused. When I entered the kitchen, my mother was standing at the stove cooking dinner. She had been there for at least 20 minutes, according to my father, who was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. I asked my mother if she had called me from the barn. She looked at me strangely and said no. She had not left the house since coming inside after helping with afternoon chores at 4 p.m. I described exactly how I had heard her voice, the tone, the inflection. She looked concerned, but suggested maybe I had heard something else. A cow making a noise that sounded like a voice, or perhaps sound carrying strangely from a neighbor's property. I accepted that explanation because it was the only one that made sense. But I felt uneasy. I know my mother's voice. I know the difference between a cow lowing and a human calling my name. 2 days later, on September 10th, it happened again. This time it was my father who experienced it. He had gone out to the barn at 10 p.m. to check on a cow that was close to calving. He was in the barn for about 10 minutes. When he came back to the house, he was pale and shaken. He said he had heard me calling for help from outside the barn near the machine shed. He said I sounded distressed, like I was injured. He ran outside calling my name, looking for me. I was not there. He searched the machine shed, the surrounding area, found nothing. He came back to the house and found me sitting in the living room watching television. I had been inside for over an hour. I had not called him. I had not been near the barn. He sat down heavily and said he must be losing his mind. My mother and I exchanged looks. That was twice now. Twice someone had heard a family member's voice calling from the barn when that person was somewhere else entirely. On September 13th, it happened to all three of us in the same night. My mother heard my father calling her name from the barn at 9:45 p.m. My father was sitting next to her on the couch. 20 minutes later, my father heard me asking for help with something in the barn. I was upstairs in my room. At 11:30 p.m., I heard both of them, my mother and father, calling my name simultaneously from 2 different locations in the barn. I was in the kitchen making tea. They were both in the living room. I walked into the living room and asked if they had called me. They had not. We sat together and talked about what was happening. We agreed that something was very wrong. The calls were too specific, too accurate. These were not auditory hallucinations or misheard sounds. These were perfect replications of our voices, calling from the barn, trying to get us to come out. We decided to test it. On September 14th, after evening milking, we all stayed in the house together. We turned off the television, turned off the radio, and sat quietly. We waited. At 8:17 p.m., we heard it. My voice calling from the barn. It said my father's name, loudly and clearly. We all heard it. We looked at each other. I had not spoken. My mouth was closed. The voice was coming from the barn, across 60 feet of open yard. My father stood and walked to the window. He said he could see the barn clearly. Nothing was moving. No lights were on inside. The cows were settled for the night. There was no reason for any sound to come from that building. But my voice called again. This time it said I needed help with a calf. My father's hand was on the doorknob. He was about to go out. My mother stopped him. She said we should not go. She said something was trying to lure us out, and we should not listen. We contacted our priest the next day. Father Dominic has served our parish for over 30 years. He is a practical man, not given to flights of fancy. We explained what was happening. He listened without interruption. When we finished, he said he had heard of similar phenomena before, though rarely. He called it a mimic. He said in folklore, certain entities or spirits can replicate human voices to lure people into danger. He said it was often associated with places where trauma or death had occurred. He asked if anything had died in the barn recently or if there had been any accidents. We told him that a farmhand had died in the barn in 1978, a man named Caleb who had been kicked in the head by a horse and bled out before the ambulance arrived. Father Dominic nodded. He said he would come to the farm and bless the property. Father Dominic arrived on September 16th. He brought holy water, blessed salt and his prayer book. He blessed every building on the property, paying special attention to the barn. He walked through every section, sprinkling holy water, praying in Latin, marking doorways with blessed salt. He spent over 2 hours performing the blessing. When he finished, he told us to remain vigilant, to not respond to voices that call from the barn, and to trust our instincts. He said if the activity continued, we should contact him immediately. He left late in the afternoon. That night, we heard nothing. The barn was silent. We thought it was over. On September 19th, it returned with intensity. This time, it was not just calling our names. It was having conversations. My mother heard my voice and my father's voice coming from the barn at the same time, talking to each other about repairing a fence. She walked outside to ask us what we were doing. We were both in the house. On September 20th, my father heard my mother singing a hymn. She always sings while doing chores. She was in bed, asleep. I heard both of them arguing about something financial, a conversation they had actually had 2 days prior, repeated word for word from the barn. It was replaying our conversations. It had learned not just our voices, but our speech patterns, our topics, our mannerisms. We installed trail cameras around the barn, motion activated with night vision. Over the next 3 nights, the cameras recorded audio of our voices calling from the barn at various times, but the video showed nothing. No people, no animals moving, no source for the sound. Just our voices disembodied, calling from empty spaces. We sent the footage to Father Dominic. He watched it and said he would contact the diocese for guidance. This was beyond his experience. On September 23rd, a representative from the diocese arrived with Father Dominic. Her name was Sister Margaret, and she had training in what the church calls spiritual discernment and deliverance ministry. She interviewed each of us separately, asking detailed questions about the phenomena. She examined the barn thoroughly. She said she felt a presence there, something old and confused. Sister Margaret performed a more extensive ritual than Father Dominic's blessing. She used prayers of protection, prayers of cleansing, and prayers commanding any non-human entities to depart. She placed blessed medals at every entrance to the barn. She told us that sometimes places hold imprints of trauma, and sometimes those imprints become active for reasons we do not fully understand. She said the death of Caleb in 1978 may have created a residual energy, or it may have opened a door to something else. She said the phenomenon we were experiencing was not demonic in the traditional sense, but it was not benign either. It was using our voices to manipulate us, to draw us out, and we did not know what its ultimate intention was. She advised us to ignore the calls completely, to never respond, and to avoid being alone outside after dark. For a week after Sister Margaret's visit, the activity stopped. The barn was silent. We resumed our normal routine cautiously. We worked in pairs, never alone. We avoided going to the barn after dark unless absolutely necessary. On October 1st, we thought it was truly over. That night, at 2:30 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my father screaming my name from the barn. It was not a call. It was a scream of terror, the sound of someone in mortal danger. I ran to my parents' room. My father was in bed, asleep. I woke him. He had not screamed. My mother woke and said she had heard it too. All 3 of us heard my father screaming for help from the barn. We sat together in the hallway, lights on until dawn. None of us slept. At first light, we went to the barn together. We found our dog, a border collie named Dutch, sitting outside the barn doors, whining and refusing to enter. We had to physically carry him away. He would not go near the barn after that night. We consulted with a paranormal investigation team from the University of Wisconsin who study unexplained phenomena. They came on October 5th with recording equipment, EMF detectors, and thermal cameras. They spent 2 nights on the property. On the second night, they captured multiple instances of our voices coming from the barn. The audio recordings were clear and undeniable. They also recorded temperature drops of up to 15 degrees in localized areas of the barn with no physical explanation. One investigator, a woman with a PhD in parapsychology, said she believed we were experiencing a genuine mimicry phenomenon, possibly tied to what she called a residual haunting combined with intelligent interaction. She said the entity, whatever it was, had learned our voices through observation and was using them to provoke reactions, possibly feeding on our fear or confusion. She said these phenomena sometimes fade over time if ignored completely, or they escalate. She could not predict which would happen in our case. We made the decision to stop using the barn for 2 weeks. We moved the cows to pasture full-time, supplemented with feed brought to them in portable troughs. We locked the barn and did not enter. The calls continued, but only at night. Every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., we heard our voices calling from the barn. We did not respond. We stayed inside, doors locked, lights on. After 2 weeks, the calls became less frequent. Once every few nights, then once a week. By late October, they stopped completely. The barn has been silent now for over a month. We have cautiously resumed using it, but we do not go there alone, and we do not go after dark. I do not know what was in our barn or if it is still there, dormant. I do not know if it was a ghost, a residual haunting, or something else entirely. What I know is that something learned our voices perfectly and used them to try to manipulate us into coming out into the dark. I do not know what would have happened if we had responded. I do not know if it intended harm or if it was simply trying to communicate in the only way it knew how. But the fear in those voices, especially the night it screamed my father's name in terror, tells me it was not benign. Something in that barn understands fear. Something knows how to use our own voices as weapons against us. We still live here. We still work the farm. But we have changed our routines. We work in daylight. We stay together. And we never, under any circumstances, respond to voices calling from the barn. If you hear a family member calling you from a place they should not be, do not go. Verify their location first. Do not trust the voice, no matter how perfect it sounds. What we thought we knew about voices and identity was wrong. Voices can be stolen. Voices can be weapons. And something out there knows how to use them. I am writing this because the authorities have asked me to document exactly what I saw and how I found it, and because I want other urban explorers to understand that some abandoned buildings are not abandoned at all. My name is DeAndre. I am a photographer based in Austin, Texas, specializing in urban decay and architectural documentation. I have explored hundreds of abandoned structures across the Southwest over the past 8 years. I understand the risks. I know about trespassing laws, structural hazards, and the importance of going with partners. On July 21st of this year, I broke my own rules. I went alone to an abandoned slaughterhouse in rural Texas, and what I found there was not decay or history. It was an active crime scene. What I witnessed saved 11 lives, but it nearly cost me my own. I am writing this so that other explorers know the signs, and so that anyone who sees something similar knows to run first and call the police second. The location came to me through an Urbex forum where people share coordinates of abandoned sites. Someone posted about an old cattle slaughterhouse approximately 40 miles southeast of San Antonio, off Farm Road 887. The post included photos showing a large industrial structure with corrugated metal siding, loading docks, and the kind of vintage signage that makes for compelling photography. The facility had closed in 2003 after repeated health code violations, according to the poster. The property was privately owned, but reportedly not patrolled. The poster claimed he had explored it 6 months prior and found it completely empty, with equipment still in place. It looked perfect for my project documenting rural industrial abandonment. I decided to photograph it on July 21st because the weather forecast predicted overcast skies, which provide ideal lighting for interior shots. I arrived at the location at 2:15 in the afternoon. The slaughterhouse sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off the farm road, surrounded by scrubland and mesquite trees. There were no other buildings visible in any direction. The facility was larger than I expected, a sprawling complex of interconnected structures covering at least 2 acres. The main building had large sliding doors, most of them closed but one partially open, rusted on its track. I parked my truck about 100 yards away, partially hidden behind a stand of trees. I took my camera, a flashlight, my phone, and a small toolkit for prying open doors if necessary. I did not tell anyone where I was going. That was my first mistake. I approached the main building cautiously, looking for signs of recent activity. The ground around the entrance was hard-packed dirt with scattered gravel. I saw tire tracks, but they looked old, eroded by weather. I saw no footprints, no trash, no obvious signs of recent human presence. I slipped through the partially open door into the main processing area. The interior was dark despite the afternoon sun. The windows were high and covered with grime. My eyes adjusted slowly. The space was enormous, an open floor plan with rusted equipment still bolted to concrete floors. There were old conveyor systems, hanging chains, stainless steel tables stained with decades of rust and biological residue. It smelled like metal, mold, and something faintly organic that I could not identify. I started photographing immediately, documenting the decay, the way light filtered through the broken skylights, the industrial bones of a dead building. I moved deeper into the complex, passing through doorways into smaller rooms. I found an office with filing cabinets still full of yellowed paperwork. A break room with a table and chairs covered in dust. A locker room with metal lockers standing open, empty. Everything looked abandoned, frozen in time since 2003. I was shooting photos methodically, room by room, when I noticed something that did not fit the timeline. In one of the side corridors, near what had been the refrigeration area, I found a recent footprint in the dust. It was clear, defined, made by a work boot with a distinctive tread. It could not have been there for 20 years. Someone had been here recently, within the past few days, based on how sharp the edges of the print were. I stopped moving and listened. The building was silent, except for wind moving through gaps in the walls and the occasional creak of settling metal. I should have left immediately. Instead, I followed the footprints. They led me down a corridor to a heavy steel door that was closed but not locked. The footprints went to this door and then back the way they came, multiple sets overlapping. I pushed the door open slowly. It led to a staircase descending into a basement level. The slaughterhouse had a lower floor, which made sense for cold storage and waste processing. The stairs were concrete, steep and narrow. I turned on my flashlight and descended carefully. The basement was divided into rooms, cold storage units with heavy insulated doors. Most were open, empty, smelling of mildew and old refrigerant. But one room at the end of the corridor had its door closed and a new padlock on it. The padlock was recent, shiny brass, completely out of place in this derelict building. I stood there, staring at it. Every instinct told me to leave, but my photographer's curiosity overrode my common sense. I thought maybe someone was using the space for storage, something mundane. I decided to see if I could look through the ventilation gap at the top of the door. I climbed onto a crate that was conveniently placed nearby and shined my flashlight through the narrow gap. What I saw made my blood freeze. The room was not empty. It contained bedding, multiple thin mattresses arranged on the floor, chains attached to the walls with cuffs, plastic buckets, bottles of water, food wrappers, and medical supplies, IV bags, syringes, gauze, all arranged on a metal table like a makeshift infirmary. The room was occupied. Not at that moment, but recently. Very recently. I could see that the mattresses had been used. I could see fresh waste in the buckets. This was not storage. This was a holding room. Someone was keeping people here. I climbed down from the crate, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. I pulled out my phone to call 911 and saw I had no signal. The basement was too deep, the walls too thick. I needed to get back upstairs, get outside, and call from there. I turned to go back up the stairs and heard voices. They were coming from above, from the main floor. Multiple voices, male, speaking in Spanish and English. I heard footsteps on the floor above my head. They were inside the building. I had been alone when I arrived. Now I was not. I turned off my flashlight immediately and pressed myself against the wall in the darkness. I heard a vehicle outside, a door slamming. More voices. Someone laughed. They were not trying to be quiet. They did not expect anyone to be here. I realized they were arriving for some kind of delivery or pickup. I was trapped in the basement while they were upstairs between me and the only exit I knew. I moved as quietly as possible back down the corridor, away from the stairs, looking for another way out. Most of the cold storage rooms had no exits except the doors to the corridor, but the last room, the one farthest from the stairs, had a small window near the ceiling and ground level outside. It was caked with dirt, but it looked like it might open. I climbed onto a rotted wooden pallet and pushed at the window. It was stuck, painted shut, or rusted. I pushed harder, using my shoulder. It gave suddenly with a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I froze, listening. The voices upstairs continued, uninterrupted. They had not heard it. I forced the window open enough to fit through. It was narrow, maybe 18 inches wide, but I am not a large person. I squeezed through, scraping my ribs and back on the frame, and dropped onto the ground outside. I was on the north side of the building, away from where I had parked. I could hear the voices clearly now, coming from the main entrance area. I could hear a vehicle idling. I stayed low and moved quickly away from the building, using scrub brush for cover. I made it to my truck without being seen, got inside, and drove down the gravel road with my headlights off until I was a quarter-mile away. Then I turned the lights on and drove fast toward the farm road. I pulled over as soon as I had cell signal and called 911. It was 3:47 p.m. I explained what I had found, where it was, and that there were people on the property right now. The dispatcher took me seriously immediately. She kept me on the line and said units were being dispatched. She told me to stay away from the location and wait for officers to meet me. 3 sheriff's deputies met me at a gas station 15 minutes later. I showed them the photos I had taken of the basement room, the chains, the medical supplies, the bedding. They called for backup immediately. By 5 p.m., there were over 20 law enforcement vehicles converging on the slaughterhouse. I was told to wait. They did not want me involved in whatever was about to happen. I waited for 3 hours at that gas station, giving statements to multiple investigators. At 8:30 p.m., a detective came to tell me what they had found. They had raided the slaughterhouse and arrested 5 men on site. They had found 11 people locked in the basement room and 2 other rooms I had not seen. The people were undocumented migrants, mostly from Central America, who had been promised agricultural work in the United States. Instead, they had been trafficked, held in the slaughterhouse, and were being prepared for forced labor on farms across Texas and Oklahoma. The medical supplies were used to treat injuries and illness so the captives would be healthy enough to work. The chains were used to restrain anyone who resisted. The operation had been running for at least 2 years, moving people through that location in groups, holding them for days or weeks before transporting them to work sites. The investigation expanded rapidly. The 5 men arrested at the slaughterhouse cooperated in exchange for reduced charges. They identified a larger network. Over the next month, federal agents made 37 additional arrests across 4 states. They shut down what the FBI described as a significant human trafficking and forced labor operation. The 11 people I had inadvertently helped rescue were placed in protective custody and given temporary visas as material witnesses. I was told that if I had not found them when I did, they were scheduled to be moved that night. Some of them had been held for 3 weeks. They were fed minimally, given no medical care beyond keeping them alive, and threatened with violence if they tried to escape or alert anyone. I testified before a grand jury in September. I provided all my photographs, my timeline, and my account of what I saw. The case is still ongoing. Multiple defendants face federal charges including human trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The property owner, who claimed to have no knowledge of how his abandoned slaughterhouse was being used, is also under investigation. I do not know if I believe him. The operation was too well established, too organized, to have gone unnoticed by someone who supposedly owned the land. I have not explored an abandoned building since July 21st. I don't know if I will again. What I thought was a dead building was very much alive, being used for something evil. I was lucky. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, if I had been upstairs when they came in, I do not know what would have happened to me. I was trespassing. I had no legal right to be there. They could have done anything. I think about that often. I also think about the 11 people in that basement. I think about how many times they heard footsteps above and hoped someone would find them. I'm glad I was the one who did, but I will never forget the feeling of being trapped in that basement, hearing voices above me, knowing that I had stumbled into something dangerous that I was not prepared for. Urban exploration is about documenting what has been left behind, but sometimes what has been left behind is not history. Sometimes it is a crime waiting to be discovered. If you explore abandoned places, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, leave immediately. If you see evidence of recent activity, leave and call the police. Do not be curious. Do not investigate. I got lucky. Others might not. I am writing this because what happens in the valley where I live cannot be explained by any scientific or rational framework I have found, and because I want people to know that some places hold sounds that should not exist. My name is Jackson. I moved to a small community in rural Kentucky in March of this year, looking for affordable housing and quiet after years of living in Louisville. The valley seemed perfect. Small population, low cost of living, beautiful Appalachian scenery. What I did not know when I signed my lease was that the valley has a phenomenon that has repeated for over a century, a sound that defies explanation and has driven multiple residents away. Or I'm writing this 6 months after moving here, and I still hear it. I have recorded it. I have researched it. I have tried to understand it. I cannot. Some sounds are not meant to be understood. Some places remember trauma in ways that violate the laws of physics. The valley is called Harlan Hollow, located in southeastern Kentucky coal country, approximately 12 miles from the nearest town of any size. The valley is narrow, roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point, carved between two steep ridges covered in oak and pine. A creek runs through the center. There are maybe 40 homes scattered along the valley floor, most of them small houses or trailers, occupied by families who have lived here for generations. The population is aging. Young people leave. The only reason housing is affordable is because no one wants to move here. I learned why within my first week. I rented a small house on the eastern side of the valley, a 2-bedroom place built in the 1970s, basic but functional. My landlord, an older man named Earl who lives 3 houses down, was friendly, but gave me a strange warning when he handed me the keys. He said the valley has what locals call the screaming nights. He said it happens every 8 to 12 days, always between midnight and 4 a.m. He said I would know it when I heard it, and that I should not be alarmed because it has been happening for as long as anyone can remember. He said people have tried to investigate, but no one has ever found an explanation. He said most people get used to it. Some people do not. He asked if I still wanted the house. I thought he was exaggerating or referring to some local wildlife. I said yes. On my 3rd night in the house, March 17th, I woke at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of screaming. Not one person screaming. Hundreds of people screaming simultaneously in absolute terror. Men, women, children, all screaming at once. The sound filled the entire valley, echoing off the ridges surrounding my house from every direction. It was the most horrifying sound I have ever heard. It lasted exactly 47 seconds. I counted later when I reviewed the recording my phone had captured automatically because I had been so startled I grabbed it and started recording without thinking. Then it stopped, instantly. Complete silence, as if someone had turned off a switch. I sat in my bed, heart pounding, shaking, waiting for some explanation. Police sirens, fire trucks. Something. Nothing came. The valley was silent. After 15 minutes, I got up, got dressed, and went outside. The night was clear and cold. I could see lights on in several houses nearby. I walked to Earl's house and knocked. He answered in his robe, looking tired but unsurprised. I asked what had just happened. He said it was the screaming night. He invited me in and made coffee. He explained that it happens regularly, has happened since at least the 1960s based on what the oldest residents remember, and possibly much longer. He said no one knows what causes it. He said the sound is heard by everyone in the valley simultaneously. He said it has been recorded dozens of times. He said researchers have come and gone. No one has an answer. He said the only thing anyone knows for certain is that it is always 47 seconds long. Always. I did not sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I talked to neighbors. Everyone confirmed Earl's story. The screaming happens every 8 to 12 days. It has been happening for decades. Some people have lived here their entire lives and have heard it hundreds of times. They treat it like weather, an unpleasant fact of life in the valley. One woman, Mrs. Callahan, told me her grandmother had talked about hearing it in the 1920s. She said the old-timers believed it was connected to the mine disaster. I asked what mine disaster. She looked at me like I should already know. She said the Harlan Hollow mine collapse of 1902. I spent the next week researching. The Harlan Hollow mine was a coal operation that employed over 300 men at its peak. On November 14, 1902, an explosion occurred deep in the mine during the night shift. The main tunnel collapsed, trapping 237 miners underground. Rescue efforts lasted 3 days, but no one was brought out alive. The mine was sealed permanently. According to newspaper accounts from the period, residents reported hearing the trapped miners screaming for hours after the collapse, their voices echoing through ventilation shafts and fissures in the rock. The screaming eventually stopped when the men died from suffocation, smoke inhalation, and injuries. The disaster devastated the community. The mine company declared bankruptcy. The valley never recovered economically. The location of the sealed mine entrance is approximately a quarter mile from my house, overgrown now, marked only by a depression in the ground and some rusted equipment half buried in the earth. I visited it on March 25th. There is no memorial, no marker, just a forgotten wound in the landscape. I stood there, trying to imagine 237 men dying slowly in the dark, their screams rising through the ground. It was unbearable to contemplate. On March 28th, at 3:14 a.m. it happened. Again. The screaming woke me from sleep. This time I was prepared. I recorded it on 3 devices simultaneously: my phone, a voice recorder, and a video camera I had set up pointing out my bedroom window. The sound was identical to the first time. Hundreds of voices screaming in terror, lasting exactly 47 seconds. I went outside immediately after it stopped. The valley was silent. No visible source, no movement, just the echo of that sound fading in my memory. I went back inside and reviewed my recordings. The audio was clear. The screaming was undeniable. But the video showed nothing. Just darkness, trees, the outlines of houses. No people, no source. I contacted a professor at the University of Kentucky who specializes in acoustics. I sent him the recordings. He called me 2 days later. He said the recordings were genuine, not fabricated or edited. He said the screaming was real human voices, not animal sounds or mechanical noise. He said the audio contained overlapping frequencies, consistent with multiple people vocalizing simultaneously. But he said the most disturbing aspect was that the recording contained characteristics of both modern digital audio and analog recordings from early 20th century technology. He said it was as if the sound itself existed in multiple time periods at once. He had no explanation. He asked if he could come to the valley and investigate. I said yes. Professor Chen arrived on April 10th with 2 graduate students and a significant amount of recording equipment. They set up microphones at 6 locations throughout the valley, covering a 2-mile area. They also brought seismic sensors to detect ground vibrations. The plan was to capture the phenomenon from multiple angles and attempt to triangulate the source. They stayed for 12 days. On April 18th, at 2:33 a.m., the screaming occurred. All 6 microphones recorded it simultaneously. The seismic sensors detected no vibrations. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Professor Chen analyzed the data for 3 days. He concluded that the sound had no identifiable point of origin. It appeared in the air itself, uniform across the entire valley. He said this violated basic principles of sound propagation. Sound requires a source. This sound had none that could be detected. Professor Chen published his findings in a paper titled Anomalous Acoustic Phenomena in Harlan Hollow, an unexplained mass auditory event. The paper was peer-reviewed and accepted by a journal that publishes research on unexplained phenomena. The conclusion was that the Harlan Hollow screaming is a genuine, repeating, unexplained event that cannot be accounted for by conventional science. The paper suggested multiple hypotheses: residual haunting, where traumatic events leave acoustic imprints that replay; geological explanations involving gas releases or rock formations that create sound; mass hallucination driven by collective expectation; or an unknown phenomenon that current science cannot measure. None of the hypotheses fully accounted for the evidence. I have now lived in Harlan Hollow for 6 months. I have heard the screaming 9 times. It happens like clockwork, every 8 to 12 days, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always lasting exactly 47 seconds. I've tried to adapt. Most of my neighbors have. They barely react anymore. When it happens, lights come on for a few minutes, then go off. People go back to sleep. Life continues. But I cannot adapt. Every time I hear it, I feel the terror in those voices. I feel the desperation of men trapped underground, screaming for help that will never come. I know logically that they died in 1902, but the sound is fresh. It is immediate. It feels present, as if it is happening right now, not over a century ago. I spoke with a woman named Mrs. Evelyn Tucker, the oldest resident in the valley. She is 94 years old. She has lived here since she was born. She said her father was one of the miners who died in the collapse. She said she has heard the screaming her entire life. She said it started approximately 5 years after the disaster around 1907. She said her mother told her that the first time it happened, people thought the mine had somehow reopened and men were dying again. They ran to the sealed entrance but found nothing. It has repeated ever since, unchanging for over 115 years. She said the screaming will never stop. She said the valley remembers what happened, and the sound is the valley's way of refusing to let those men be forgotten. I recorded an interview with Mrs. Tucker. I asked her if she was afraid of the screaming. She said no. She said it is a memorial. She said the men died screaming for help, and no one could reach them. She said maybe the sound is their way of making sure no one ever forgets what happened here. She said they died alone in the dark, and the sound is proof that they existed, that they mattered. She said if the screaming ever stops, it will mean the valley has finally let them go. She said she hopes it never stops. I've thought about moving. The rent is cheap, but the psychological cost is high. Hearing hundreds of people scream in terror every 8 to 12 days wears on the mind, but I have also come to understand Mrs. Tucker's perspective. This is a memorial, an acoustic monument to tragedy. 237 men died here, forgotten by history, their deaths unmarked except by this sound. If I leave, I am participating in that forgetting. If I stay, I am bearing witness. I am writing this because I want people to know that Harlan Hollow exists, that the disaster happened, and that the men who died there are still screaming. I do not know if the sound is supernatural, geological, or something else entirely. I do not know if it is the voices of the dead or an echo trapped in the rocks. But I know it is real. I have the recordings. I have the research. I have the testimony of generations of residents. The screaming happens. It has happened for over a century. It will probably happen for another century. And maybe that is not a curse. Maybe it is the only justice those men will ever receive. Their deaths were horrific and largely ignored, but they cannot be forgotten because the valley will not let them be forgotten. Every 8 to 12 days, the earth opens its mouth and screams for them, and we listen, because that is the least we can do. I am writing this because what I witnessed over 6 weeks in rural Nebraska has never been adequately explained, and because I want other rural mail carriers and residents in agricultural areas to know the warning signs if this pattern ever repeats. My name is Kalen. I have been a rural mail carrier for the United States Postal Service for 11 years, serving a route that covers approximately 80 miles through farmland in central Nebraska, crossing 3 counties. I know every farm, every family, and every landmark on my route. I notice when things change. In late August of this year, things started changing in ways that made no sense. Scarecrows began appearing in impossible locations, arranged in a pattern that seemed designed to watch my route like surveillance markers. Simultaneously, livestock mutilations began occurring at farms along the same path. The scarecrows always appeared at mutilation sites within 24 hours. After 6 weeks, the activity stopped as suddenly as it began. No arrests were made. No explanation was given. But I documented everything, and I believe someone was conducting organized activity across multiple properties for a purpose I still do not understand. My route begins in the town of Kozad and extends north and west through farming communities, covering approximately 45 delivery stops spread across 80 miles of county roads. Most of my customers are multi-generational farming families. I have delivered their mail for over a decade. I know their routines, their livestock, their crops. On August 19th, I noticed the first scarecrow that did not make sense. It was standing in the middle of a farm pond on the Henderson property, approximately 15 feet from shore, in water that should have been 4 feet deep. The scarecrow was upright, as if standing on something submerged, dressed in denim overalls and a flannel shirt with a burlap sack head. I stopped my vehicle and stared at it. Scarecrows belong in fields, not ponds. I made a note to ask Mr. Henderson about it when I saw him next. 2 days later, on August 21st, I saw a second scarecrow in an impossible location. This one was on top of a grain silo on the Kowalski farm, standing upright on the narrow peaked roof 50 feet above the ground. There was no ladder, no platform, no way anyone could have safely placed it there. I photographed it with my phone. That afternoon, I delivered mail to the Kowalski house and asked Mrs. Kowalski about the scarecrow on the silo. She looked at me with confusion and said they had not put anything on the silo. She came outside with me, looked up, and went pale. She said her husband would check it, but she had no idea how it got there. I continued my route, unsettled. On August 23rd, I found a third scarecrow hanging from a power line between 2 utility poles on County Road 47. It was suspended in the middle of the line, 40 feet above the road, swaying slightly in the wind. This was not just strange, This was dangerous. Power lines are maintained by utility companies. No farmer would risk electrocution to hang a scarecrow. I called the power company from my vehicle. They said they would send someone to investigate. By the time I returned on my route the next day, the scarecrow was gone, but the power company had no record of removing it. They said their crew had found nothing when they arrived. I started keeping a detailed log. Each scarecrow appeared in a location that was impossible or dangerous to access. Each was constructed identically: denim overalls, flannel shirt in earth tones, burlap sack head with no facial features, straw stuffing. Each was positioned to face the next property on my mail route, as if watching the direction I traveled. By August 28th, I had documented 7 scarecrows. The pattern was unmistakable. They formed a line along my route, each one positioned to observe the next farm. I reported this to my postmaster. She listened, took notes, and said she would contact local authorities if I felt unsafe. I did not feel unsafe at that point. I felt confused. On August 30th, everything changed. I arrived at the Morrison farm to deliver a package and found Mrs. Morrison in her driveway, visibly upset. She told me someone had killed one of her cows during the night. The cow had been found in the pasture, dead, with surgical precision cuts. The udders had been removed. There was no blood at the scene, which made no sense for such an injury. The organs had been extracted through small incisions. Mrs. Morrison had called the sheriff. When I left the Morrison farm and continued my route, I saw a new scarecrow. It was standing at the fence line of the Morrison property, facing the road, facing me. It had not been there yesterday. I photographed it and drove immediately back to the Morrison farm. I told Mrs. Morrison about the scarecrow. She had not seen it appear. It had not been there when she went to bed the previous night. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern accelerated. A mutilation occurred at a farm. Within 24 hours, a scarecrow appeared at the site. The mutilations were always livestock, cattle, or sheep, always killed with surgical precision, always with organs removed and no blood. The scarecrows always appeared facing the next property on my mail route. By September 12th, there had been 9 mutilations and 13 scarecrows. The sheriff's department was investigating, but they had no leads, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the dead animals and the scarecrows. Trail cameras set up by farmers captured nothing useful. The footage showed the animals alive one moment, and in the next frame, hours later, dead. No figures, no vehicles, no lights, just a time gap and a dead animal. I reviewed my photographs and noticed something that made my skin crawl. The scarecrows were not just facing the next property. They were facing locations where mutilations would occur days later. The scarecrow at the Morrison farm had been facing the Chen farm. 3 days later, the Chens found a mutilated calf. The scarecrow at the Chen farm faced the Rodriguez property. 2 days later, the Rodriguez family found a dead sheep. The scarecrows were appearing before the mutilations, not after. They were predictive. Someone was marking targets. On September 15th, a scarecrow appeared in my own yard. I live in a small house on the edge of Kozad, not on a farm, not on my mail route. The scarecrow was standing in my front yard, facing my house when I came home from work. I did not touch it. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Marshal arrived within 20 minutes, took photographs, and removed the scarecrow as evidence. He told me to stay somewhere else that night. I stayed with my sister in town. The next morning, I found my mailbox destroyed, crushed flat as if something very heavy had fallen on it. The scarecrow in evidence at the sheriff's office had vanished from the locked evidence room overnight. No one saw it leave. The security footage showed the room empty one moment, and in the next frame, the scarecrow was gone. That is not possible. Evidence rooms are locked and monitored, but it happened. The sheriff's department contacted the FBI. Cattle mutilations across multiple properties, combined with the scarecrow phenomenon, suggested organized activity. Federal agents arrived on September 18th. They interviewed every farmer who had experienced mutilations. They collected the remaining scarecrows for forensic analysis. The materials were common: denim purchased from farm supply stores, burlap sacks available at any hardware store, straw from any field. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence. The scarecrows were assembled with basic sewing, the kind anyone with minimal skills could perform. The FBI found nothing that identified a person or group. On September 20th, trail cameras at 3 separate farms captured identical footage. At 2:47 a.m., multiple figures appeared in the fields. They moved in coordinated patterns, walking in straight lines, stopping at specific points, standing motionless for extended periods. The figures wore dark clothing and moved without flashlights. The footage was heavily distorted, pixelated beyond recognition. Facial features were impossible to discern. One farmer, Mr. Chin, reviewed his footage and said the figures moved like they were measuring something. They walked precise distances, stopped, appeared to mark locations, and moved on. The pattern suggested surveying or mapping, but for what purpose, no one could determine. On September 23rd, the activity stopped. No new mutilations, no new scarecrows. The existing scarecrows began to disappear. Farmers who had left them in place as evidence found them gone overnight. No one saw them being removed. By September 27th, every scarecrow was gone. The trail cameras showed nothing unusual. The fields were empty. Whatever had been happening for 6 weeks simply ended. The FBI continued investigating through October, but found nothing. The case was classified as unsolved. I researched historical records for similar events. I found 2. In 1987, newspapers in the region reported a series of cattle mutilations and strange scarecrow sightings over a 6-week period in late summer. The activity stopped without explanation. In 1971, similar reports appeared in archived county records. Mutilations, scarecrows in unusual locations, and coordinated activity across multiple farms. The pattern repeated every 16 years. 1971, 1987, 2003 saw scattered reports but less documentation, and now 2024. The next occurrence, if the pattern holds, will be in 2040. I spoke with an elderly farmer named Mr. Dietrich, who has lived in the area his entire life. He is 89 years old. He remembers 1971. He said his father experienced the same thing in 1955, though there were no formal reports. He said the old-timers in the 1950s said it had happened before, going back generations. He said no one has ever understood what it is or why it happens. He said the scarecrows are markers. He said the mutilations are not about the animals. He said someone or something is surveying the land. He said the animals are incidental, chosen for convenience. He said the purpose is the pattern itself. He said it will happen again. I do not know what I witnessed. I do not know if it was a cult, a group of individuals conducting bizarre rituals, a government experiment, or something non-human. What I know is that it was organized, coordinated across multiple properties, and executed with precision that suggests planning and resources. The scarecrows were impossible to place without equipment, yet no one saw equipment. The mutilations were surgical, yet no one saw anyone approach the animals. The figures on the trail cameras moved in patterns that suggested purpose, yet left no trace. I documented everything. I provided all my photographs, my log, and my testimony to the FBI. The case remains open but inactive. I still drive my mail route. I still deliver to the same farms, but I watch for scarecrows now. I watch for patterns. If I see a scarecrow in an impossible location, I will not assume it is harmless. I will not wait to see what happens next. I will call authorities immediately. I will document everything, and I will remember that some activities in rural areas are not what they appear to be. Some patterns are not natural. Some surveillance is not conducted by people we can understand. The scarecrows were watching. The mutilations were part of a larger design, And whatever conducted this activity in 2024 has done it before and will do it again. I hope when it returns in 2040, someone will be paying attention. I hope they will have better answers than we do, because I have none. All I have is the documentation, the pattern, and the certainty that something very strange happens in these fields every 16 years. And no one knows why.